So today I'm going to share with you basically the core concept of my thesis research, which is interdependent diffusion. And that's probably a topic that most people haven't heard of. It's partly because I made up the word, and partly because it's a synthesis of a bunch of new research that's coming out in the area of social contagion. So when we think about social contagion of ideas or beliefs, we're thinking about the way one person can adopt a belief or think that an idea is relevant and then share it with their peers or their neighbors. And so here's an example of what that might look like. Is on the 18th of June, 2015, the Treasury announced that the portrait of a woman would appear on a $10 bill. And this piece of information was spread through the US population as individuals were exposed to it, and they thought that it was relevant and interesting, and they decided to share it with their friends, either online or through word of mouth in the real world. Here's another example. The same day, news broke about a shooting in Charleston, South Carolina, in which a white gunman killed 9 churchgoers. Now, this piece of information spread through the population in the same day and much farther and faster than the information about the portrait of the woman. But when we're thinking about the diffusion of these two ideas, we don't really need to think about the diffusion of the $10 bill to understand the diffusion of information about the shooting and vice versa. That's because we can think about these diffusants as being independent of one another, and that your adoption of belief A isn't likely to change your susceptibility to belief B and vice versa. And this is a really useful assumption because it means that we can study the diffusion of a single belief and see how it spreads through the social network. And then when we have multiple beliefs, we can sort of stack them on top of each other and linearly superimpose those diffusion processes to get a sense of the whole picture. And scholars have been using this assumption for the last 50 years in their research. So both on the theoretical side and the empirical side, pretty much all of the papers that you're going to see in your intro to social networks or social contagion studies are going to be founded on this assumption that there's one thing spreading through the network at a time. And if we can understand the diffusion of that one thing, we can understand the diffusion of all things. But let's look at a case where that's clearly not true. This is a message that came out the very next day in which it became apparent that the shooter had self-identified with the Confederate flag. And another message spreading on the same day was a reminder that the Confederate flag was currently flying over the South Carolina state capitol grounds, and a call to remove that flag. Now, we can't think about these two contagion processes as independent, because if you're exposed to the knowledge that the shooter had identified with the Confederate flag, then when you're exposed to the second idea that this flag was still flying over the Capitol grounds, you're more likely to think that it's politically relevant and worth sharing, and vice versa. If you already think the flag should come down, then hearing about the shooter's identification of the flag, you might say, this is politically relevant and worth sharing. So these diffusants are interdependent in that the adoption of A does influence the likelihood of adopting B. And both theories and empirical studies about this are a little more scarce. So that bottom one there is the paper I'm presenting with you today, and the little dots on the right-hand side in the empirical column, that's some work that I'm going to present just the starting stages of for you at the end of my presentation. But the real question here is, does this even matter? Do we need to relax the assumption of independence? It'll matter if there are new sociological processes that are going on, if we can predict new outcomes from those processes, and if there are any practical consequences for policymakers. So just to give you the answer straight away, one of the things that we're interested in is polarization in this population. And what we're going to find is that interdependence creates an entirely new mechanism that can lead to polarization in that population. So let's make it concrete. Here's 3 friends, Joe, Ellen, and Susanna, and they have some beliefs. The shooting was a case of racial violence, and the Confederate flag symbolizes racial violence. And because they share these beliefs in common, there's some similarity in their belief sets between them. So we can look at that similarity and see how it evolves over time. Now let's say that Ellen is exposed to a new belief and she adopts it, that the Confederate flag is flown by the state government. Maybe she shares this with Joe. What does this do? So this actually increases their similarity with each other and decreases their similarity with Susanna. So now what happens? Somebody else comes along and suggests to them that the state government endorses racial violence. Now, if these individuals are using their existing knowledge to determine whether or not to adopt this new belief, then Joe and Ellen, having this belief that the Confederate flag is flown by the state government, might be more likely to adopt it. But Susanna, not having that belief, is less likely to do so. So what's happened here is that as Joe and Ellen have become more similar, they've started to behave in the same way with respect to new information that they're exposed to. And so again, they're more likely to become even more similar, and their dissimilarity with Susanna is again amplified. And so what we have is this cascade where the more similar individuals are to one another, the more likely they are to behave in a similar way going forward and become similar again. So this is the sort of mechanism, but what does this do at the scale of the population? I'll show you some results of a simulation here. If we take a population, a simulated population of 60 agents, and we say, let's give them some beliefs and let them share those beliefs with each other. And because this is a simulation, we can force in one condition for those individuals to use their existing beliefs to decide what to adopt next. And in another condition, we can go back to that assumption of independent diffusion and just assume that they have some prior susceptibility to each belief. And then we can see how these two populations differ as they evolve over time, starting from the same initial conditions. And what we'll do is we'll start by looking at the similarity between all pairs of individuals. And what we'll do is we'll look at the top 95th percentile relationships, set of relationships, and that's representing relationships between people who are within the same ideological camp. And we can look at the 5th percentile relationships, and those relationships are people who are across camp. And if we first look at independent diffusion, this is the assumption of most of the literature, what we see is that over time, with some startup noise, the people who are within the same camp become more similar to one another as they share beliefs, and this isn't surprising. We also see that some information is able to propagate across camps, so that the similarity between people who disagree actually increases, so that they disagree less. Now what happens if we allow them to use their beliefs to decide what to adopt next? Let's go to interdependent diffusion. So interdependent diffusion, the first thing it's going to do is amplify that similarity between self-similar individuals, make them more likely to adopt from their self-similar peers. And the other thing that it's doing is it's keeping information from flowing across the network to the opposite camp. We can look at this as well in the way we normally think about polarization as being an alignment along a political axis. So here what we might say is, how well does a political axis describe this population? And we can use a principal component analysis to say, if we map this population to a point space, how linear is that point space when we look at the most defining dimension of that point space? So down at the bottom of the graph, you'll see a population which is all mixed up and there's no real political axis present. And at the top, you'll see a more defined political axis. So when we look at independent diffusion, we see that in the simulation, there is some increase in the ability to categorize this population on a political axis just because we move away from randomness. But when we add interdependence, we double that effect because people are able to sort themselves based upon their beliefs. And so we're able to use one person's belief on one axis to tell us something about their belief on another axis. Now, this is all well and good, but it's just a simulation, and I've just told you about the logical consequences of a few ideas. Can we actually see the effect in the real world? So I'm going to show you the result of an experiment that's currently in progress, and I wish I could show you the full results, but things got a little delayed with the coronavirus changes, so you get to see sort of things as they're in process. So what I did was I took individuals from Amazon Mechanical Turk and put them in an artificial social network and gave them an artificial set of beliefs. And those beliefs are clues to a mystery. So what we did was we told them a priceless relic has been stolen from the Pine Street Gallery, and we're going to give you some clues. And what we want you to do is sort those clues with your neighbors in the social network into those that are true and false. And those clues that people think are true get shared with their neighbors. And then when people see that their neighbors have updated their beliefs of what is true, then they're able to adopt those beliefs as well. And we give them 8 minutes and they take their time sort of sorting these clues into true beliefs and false beliefs. And what we see is that over the course of time, people are able to sort of find a solution to this mystery that they believe in. Now, the manipulation here is that we're going to change the structure of the clues, because what we want to do is create a world in which in one world, all the beliefs interact, and in another world, all the beliefs don't interact. Now, we're doing this in an experiment because that's notoriously difficult to do in the real world. So how do we do that? By constructing clues. So I'll start with a crime scene and a stolen object, and I'll add 3 suspects, 2 articles of clothing, 2 descriptions, 2 tools, and 2 vehicles. And then I'll connect these in each with a clue. So Hayes was seen at the Daily Auction House. We can do this for all the pairs of clues. Now, when you look at this diagram, you see a whole set of independent clues. This could be a really independent world because nothing that we know about Hayes tells us anything about what's going on with the blue blazer. So if we want to create interdependence between these clues, we just create crosslinks. So that's another set of clues that we can create between each set. So in this world, all the clues are interacting and all the clues are interdependent. Now we want to create a control world where those clues are not interacting. We want to preserve the fundamental structure of the game. So we want to use as many of the clues as we can from before. So we'll just bring over the ones that start by connecting to the crime scene and the stolen object. Now we want to say something about Snyder to preserve the initial condition of the game, but we don't want to say that he was a burly man. So we'll tell you something else about him and sort of break that connection between those clues. We'll say that Hayes here has a tattoo of a bear. Now, what does this do to the structure of our clue network? First, we break the structure of clues by breaking one end of the connection. If we do this for every set of clues, then what you see is that we again have this independent world where each of those clues that relates to Barnes or to the blue blazer is independent of each other. And so now we can test these 2 comparative worlds in which one world has interdependence between their beliefs and the other world doesn't. So what do we see? Now, these are preliminary results just from pilot tests, so keep your eyes peeled for updates. But the results are encouraging in that we see that this amplification of the dissimilarity between individuals is amplified for the interdependent condition, and that within camps, people are, again, becoming more self-similar in the interdependent world than in the independent world. We find that polarization can emerge in homogeneous populations that are well-connected, have no desire to form groups, and have no predefined issues to disagree over entirely from the way beliefs interact.